Welcome to this month's edition of RTO Insights, brought to you by APRO, the Association of Progressive Rental Organizations, the National Trade Association for the Rent-to-Own Industry, and sponsored by Rent Direct, a division of Nationwide, the nation's largest TV appliance and furniture retail buying group. You know that from time to time the industry has been pilloried in the press over salacious tales of bad collections, and the latest scandal is pet rentals, which has been in the news of late. What you may not know is how the government has acted toward the RTO industry when it has taken time to examine it in some detail. And I think you'd be surprised, and I want to kind of go over some of those events from the federal government, because I think it'll give you a better feeling about the business you're in than some of the reports on the 6 o'clock news lately. For example, the Department of Defense a few years ago, back in 2006 and then again in 2010, was studying the whole subprime world and whether or not service members were being preyed upon by payday lenders and retailers that located around military bases. And they were going to pass some rules to hamstring those industries in order that service members not be locked into debt spirals, is what the Department of Defense called them. And the RTO industry was mentioned in one of the initial surveys conducted by the Department of Defense. But once they dug into the industry a little bit, they concluded that indeed RTO transactions never cause service members to go into debt at all, much less a death spiral of debt. And so they left us out of the new regulations that they enacted here a few years ago in this century. Before that, during the Clinton administration, the Federal Trade Commission conducted a study of the RTO industry, and some of their findings are still interesting today, even though that study was done in the year 2000. The name of that study is Federal Trade Commission Bureau of Economics Staff Report Survey of Rent-to-Own Customers, published in April of 2000. What those surveyors did was make telephone calls to 12,000 American households, out of which they were able to locate 500 households that had used the RTO transaction at some point during the past 5 years. The demographics of those 500 customers, and they deemed 500 to be a satisfactory survey and representative of the nation within a margin of error of 4%, plus or minus. 31% of those surveyed were African Americans. 79% of those surveyed were between the ages of 18 and 44, and 62% rented their dwellings. I suspect that those statistics remain relatively true today, 17 years after this survey. I don't know that the demographics of our rental customers have changed markedly. The survey found that 2/3 of RTO customers intended to own the merchandise when they signed their rental agreement. I would have thought that that statistic would have been higher, and suspect that in truth it probably is higher. 75% of those customers surveyed were satisfied with their rent-to-own experience. They were particularly satisfied with the quality of the merchandise and how they were treated in the store. 19% were dissatisfied with the transaction, mainly because they felt like the prices were too high. That still remains a criticism of the industry today, due mainly to our inability to explain the benefits and features and benefits of RTO transactions in detail, and that allows customers simply to look at the cash price of the thing being rented versus the discount cash prices in retail stores or on the internet. That's a false comparison, but it is one that is hard to dispel. Among those surveyed, 1/2 of customers were late making payments at least once. I thought that was an interesting statistic, and I have seen seminars conducted where rental dealers urge their store employees not to get too excited about late payments, and in fact some customers make a late payment almost every time but are still good repeat customers that have generated thousands of dollars in revenue for the rental companies. So the industry shouldn't get too excited about customers who are late, because they are. 84% of the customers surveyed own their vehicles. 44% of those customers in 2000 had credit cards. 50% had a savings account. 64% had a checking account. The conclusion of the Federal Trade Commission that the typical RTO customer is not part of the unbanked population of Americans. Those citizens who do not have any banking relationship at all and are therefore driven to payday lenders, pawn shops, and the like. The average rental term, and this was interesting I thought, was 5 months. Customers kept it for an average of 5 months and then either gave it back or bought it. 81% of those customers surveyed returned the property within 6 months or less. That statistic has remained fairly consistent for as long as I've been involved in the industry, since 1980. After 6 months, once a customer has gotten 6 months into a deal, 90% of those customers get ownership of the property. The FTC asked questions about collection practices and found that abusive collection practices were very rare. Only 2 of the 500 RTO customers surveyed reported or alleged abusive collection practices. That caused the Federal Trade Commission to conclude that there was no particular need to enact or to enact either laws or regulations restricting collection practices of RTO companies more than they are already at the state level, because there simply is no material abuse going on the collection end of RTO. The one blip in an otherwise generally favorable survey about the industry was the finding that the keep rate was 70%. Our suspicion is that customers, when asked on the telephone, did you end up owning the merchandise, often said yes when the truth to that question was no, because either they were embarrassed that they had to give the TV back, or they had simply forgotten because they were surveying over a 5-year period, and customers who had rented something 4 or 5 years ago may simply have forgotten whether they got ownership or not. We have, as a trade association, hard industry data showing that keep rates vary from 25 to 40% based on whether you have a weekly RTO model or a monthly RTO model. Those statistics don't really come from the trade association itself, but rather come from economics professors at various universities who have been given access to the data from rent-to-own companies, actual reports from those companies about deliveries and pickups and who owns the stuff and who gives it back, and they have compiled those statistics. And so we believe that our keep rate statistics are more accurate than were the telephone surveys of the Federal Trade Commission. But otherwise, we like what the Federal Trade Commission said. One of the criticisms during that era was that RTO companies are gouging customers and making obscene profits. The Federal Trade Commission found no evidence of that whatsoever. It looked at the public company profitability, which was in single digits and is reported because they're public companies. And it also noted that it was that this industry is easy to get into, that all you needed was an inventory and a truck and some rental agreements, and you could start renting TVs. So there were no barriers to entry, which is what the Federal Trade Commission looks at when they are determining whether or not the marketplace is competitive. So if you have not looked at the Federal Trade Commission study lately, I would commend you or recommend that you do that. We also have the Beamer telephone surveys every 5 years, and they provide valuable information about customer attitudes toward the industry, and we need to know how our customers feel about us so that we can serve them better. And remember, treat your customers like royalty. They deserve it.